1904, Portrait Resurfaces, and historians pale as they enlarge the image of the bride. The photograph arrived at the New Orleans Historical Collection in a water-stained cardboard box, part of an estate donation from a Garden District mansion being cleared after its elderly owner's death. Archivist Claire Duchamp had seen hundreds of such donations, attics and basements yielding forgotten treasures and mundane debris in equal measure. Most items required careful cataloging, but revealed little of historical significance. This particular box contained typical remnants of a wealthy family's past: silk gloves, yellowed letters tied with ribbon, a tarnished silver compact, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, a single large photograph in an ornate brass frame. Claire carefully removed the frame and examined the image. It was a formal wedding portrait, the kind of elaborate studio photograph common among New Orleans society families at the turn of the century. The photographer's embossed mark in the corner read, "Laveau and Son Portrait Studio, Royal Street, 1904. The portrait showed a bride and groom posed in the classical style of the era. The groom stood tall and rigid in a dark, formal suit, his expression serious, one hand resting on an ornamental chair. Beside him sat the bride, her white dress a masterpiece of Edwardian fashion. Layers of silk, intricate lacework, a high collar adorned with pearls. But what immediately caught Claire's attention was the bride's veil. It was unusually dense, made of heavy lace that created deep shadows across her face. Most bridal portraits from this period showed veils pulled back to reveal the bride's features clearly. These photographs were meant to document beauty and status, but this veil hung forward, obscuring much of the woman's face, creating an almost ghostly effect. Claire moved the photograph to her desk and positioned her magnifying lamp over it. The image quality was remarkable for its age. The Laveau studio had been known for technical excellence. She could see individual pearls on the bride's dress, the texture of the groom's mustache, the grain of the wooden chair, but the bride's face remained shadowed, mysterious. Claire could make out the shape of her features, the curve of her jaw, but the expression was impossible to read through the heavy veil. Something about the pose felt wrong, uncomfortable. The bride's posture seemed too rigid, her hands clutched together in her lap with a tension that suggested anxiety rather than joy. Claire made a note to have the photograph digitally scanned and enhanced. Modern imaging technology could often reveal details invisible to the naked eye, even in century-old photographs. She had a feeling this particular image might benefit from closer examination. As she carefully placed the portrait in an acid-free protective sleeve, Claire couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Every wedding photograph she had ever catalogued radiated some sense of celebration, even those from arranged marriages in conservative eras. This one radiated something else entirely. It radiated fear. 2 days later, Claire sat beside Marcus Reed in the collection's digital imaging laboratory. Marcus had worked with historical photographs for 12 years, specializing in restoration and enhancement of damaged or faded images. He approached each photograph as a puzzle, teasing out information hidden by time, deterioration, or inadequate original exposure. "This one's in excellent condition structurally," Marcus observed as the high-resolution scan appeared on his monitor. The Laveau studio used top-quality materials. The album in print has survived remarkably well, but that veil is going to be challenging. It's creating significant shadow across the subject's face. Claire pulled her chair closer. "Can you work around it? I want to see her expression, her eyes. Something about this portrait feels off." Marcus's fingers moved across his keyboard, applying initial adjustments. The image sharpened, contrast increased slightly. He zoomed into the bride's face, filling the screen with the veiled features. The heavy lace created a complex pattern of light and shadow, but modern software could analyze and compensate for such obstacles. "Let me try increasing shadow detail without overexposing the highlights," Marcus said, adjusting multiple parameters simultaneously. "This will take a few minutes to process properly." The software worked its calculations, and gradually the bride's face became clearer. The shape of her nose emerged, the line of her lips, the contours of her cheeks beneath the veil. Marcus continued refining the enhancement, bringing up midtones, clarifying details. Then Claire saw it. "Marcus, stop. Right there." On the screen, now unmistakably visible, were streaks running down the bride's cheeks. Not shadows from the veil, but actual moisture. Tears captured in the moment the photograph was taken. The bride had been crying during her wedding portrait. "That's unusual," Marcus said quietly. Emotional brides weren't uncommon, but photographers typically waited for composure before exposing the plate. These studios charged significant fees. Clients expected perfect images. "Can you enhance it further?" Claire's voice was tense. "I want to see everything." Marcus applied additional filters, sharpening the focus even more. He adjusted the tonal curve, bringing out every possible detail in the shadowed areas beneath the veil. The bride's face filled the screen, and now they could see not just tears, but her expression. Eyes wide, jaw tight, every muscle in her face conveying distress. And then Marcus saw something else. He zoomed in further, focusing on the area around the bride's left eye. Where the veil's shadow was deepest, he increased the exposure, compensating for the darkness. The discoloration became visible gradually, but once they saw it, there was no mistaking what it was. A bruise, dark and substantial, spreading from the bride's eye socket toward her temple. The heavy veil hadn't been a fashion choice or a stylistic decision. It had been a deliberate attempt to hide evidence of violence. Claire and Marcus sat in silence, staring at the screen. The crying bride, the concealing veil, the hidden bruise. This was not a wedding portrait. It was documentation of something far darker. "We need to identify these people," Claire said finally. "I need to know who she was and what happened to her." The Lavo and Son Portrait Studio had been one of New Orleans' most prestigious photography establishments in the early 1900s, catering to wealthy Creole and American families in the French Quarter and Garden District. The business had closed in 1932, but its records had been preserved by the Louisiana Photography Archive, housed in a climate-controlled facility near Tulane University. Claire contacted the archive's director, Dr. Simone Bertrand, explaining what she had found. Simone had dedicated her career to preserving New Orleans' photographic heritage and immediately understood the significance of Claire's discovery. "The Laveau sitting books are quite complete for that period," Simone said when Claire arrived at the archive the next afternoon. "They were meticulous record keepers. Every client, every session, payment details, even notes about special requests or difficulties during sittings. They located the ledger for 1904 and began searching through entries from the spring and summer months. Wedding portraits were marked with a small decorative symbol in the margin, a tradition the Laveau studio had maintained to distinguish these important commissions from ordinary sittings. On June 18, 1904, they found it. Wedding portrait, Miss Amélie Devereux and Mr. Robert Thornton, 4 plates exposed, special sitting arrangement, 15 montants worked, paid in advance by Devereux family. The price was substantial, more than double the usual rate for wedding portraits, and the notation, special sitting arrangement, was unusual. Claire had seen hundreds of entries in the ledger, and very few included such remarks. Amélie Devereux, Claire repeated the name. The Devereux family was prominent in New Orleans society. I've seen the name in other collections. They owned sugar plantations upriver and had significant real estate holdings in the city. Simone was already pulling additional records. The Laveau studio kept a separate journal, more personal observations than the business ledger. The owner, Jean-Baptiste Laveau, was known for recording his thoughts about particularly memorable or difficult sessions. Let me see if there's an entry for this date. The journal was smaller, leather-bound, filled with Jean-Baptiste's flowing handwriting. Simone turned to June 1904 and found several entries. On June 19th, the day after the Devereux-Thornton sitting, Jean-Baptiste had written extensively, "Yesterday's wedding portrait troubles my conscience still. The Devereux family arrived with the bride at precisely 10 o'clock, as scheduled. Miss Amélie was accompanied by her mother, Madame Céleste Devereux, and the groom, Mr. Robert Thornton. Also present were Monsieur Henri Devereux, the bride's father, and Mr. Thornton's associate, whose name I did not catch, but whose presence seemed to make everyone uncomfortable. The bride herself appeared unwell, pale, with reddened eyes suggesting recent tears. When I inquired whether we should postpone the sitting to allow her to compose herself, Madame Devereux intervened sharply, insisting we proceed immediately. The bride said nothing, simply stared at the floor. Most disturbing was the veil. Madame Devereux had brought it herself, an unusually heavy piece, far denser than customary bridal veils. She insisted it be positioned forward, covering much of her daughter's face. When I suggested this would obscure the bride's features, the very purpose of a wedding portrait, Madame Devereux became agitated, stating the veil was essential and must remain as positioned. Jean-Baptiste's entry continued, and Claire felt her chest tighten as she read. I positioned the couple as requested, Mr. Thornton standing, the bride seated, the heavy veil arranged to cast maximum shadow. Through my lens, I could see the bride trembling. Not the nervous excitement of a young woman on her wedding day, but fear. Unmistakable, profound fear. Mr. Thornton kept his hand on her shoulder throughout the sitting, firmly, possessively. When I asked the bride to turn her head slightly to improve the composition, his grip visibly tightened and she flinched. He smiled at me, a cold, practiced smile, and said his bride was simply overwhelmed by the momentousness of the occasion. I exposed 4 plates, though I knew even one would have sufficed. I wanted the family gone. The atmosphere in my studio felt poisonous, wrong. As they prepared to leave, the bride looked at me directly for the first time. Even through that cursed veil I could see her eyes, and what I saw there haunts me. She was pleading, silently, desperately pleading for help. But what could I do? The marriage contract was legal. The family's in agreement. A photographer does not interfere in the private affairs of wealthy clients, and yet I find I cannot shake the feeling that I have participated in something terrible. When Madame Devereux returned 3 days later to collect the finished portraits, she examined them carefully, nodded with satisfaction, and paid the remainder due. She mentioned that her daughter and new son-in-law had already departed for an extended honeymoon abroad. She did not say where. I pray I am wrong. I pray that young woman finds happiness in her marriage. But I fear she will not. Claire and Simone sat in silence after finishing the entry. Jean-Baptiste Laveau had witnessed something deeply wrong, had documented it through his camera, and had been haunted by his inability to intervene. "We need to find out what happened to Amélie Devereux after this photograph," Claire said. "Marriage records, society announcements, anything that tells us where she went and whether she survived." Simone was already making notes. The Devereux family would have been prominent in social circles. The Times-Picayune and the Daily States both covered high society events extensively. If there were announcements about the wedding or the couple's subsequent activities, they would have been reported. But Claire was thinking about Jean-Baptiste's final observation. The couple had departed for an extended honeymoon abroad, destination unknown. In 1904, abroad could mean anywhere. Europe, South America, even Asia. Tracking someone who had left the country with no specified destination would be nearly impossible, unless something had happened to bring them back into public record. A death, a scandal, a legal matter that required documentation. Claire needed to search not just for happy announcements of a successful marriage, but for any trace of Amélie Devereux Thornton in the years following that terrible wedding photograph. "I'll start with the newspapers," Claire said. "Marriage announcements first, then any subsequent mentions of either the Devereux or Thornton families. There has to be something. People this wealthy don't just disappear." But even as she said it, Claire felt a chill. In 1904, a married woman effectively became her husband's property. If Robert Thornton wanted his wife to disappear, if he wanted to take her far from family and witnesses, the law would have been entirely on his side. And that heavy veil, hiding tears and bruises, suggested that was exactly what he had intended. The Times-Picayune archives were digitized and searchable, making Claire's research significantly easier than it would have been even a decade earlier. She started with June 1904, looking for the wedding announcement that would have preceded the portrait sitting. She found it in the June 12th edition, 1 week before the photograph was taken. "Marriage of interest to society. Miss Amélie Céleste Devereux, daughter of Monsieur Henri and Madame Céleste Devereux of Audubon Place, to Mr. Robert Harrison Thornton of Boston, Massachusetts. The ceremony will be held at the Devereux family residence on June 17th, followed by a private reception for family and intimate friends. Mr. Thornton is associated with maritime shipping interests and has recently established business connections in New Orleans. The couple will reside abroad following the wedding." The announcement was brief, almost perfunctory, unusual for a family as prominent as the Devereux. Most society weddings received extensive coverage, detailing the bride's gown, the floral arrangements, the guest list, the elaborate reception. This announcement read more like an obligation than a celebration. Claire noted several details. Robert Thornton was from Boston, associated with maritime shipping interests, and had only recently established connections in New Orleans. The wedding was to be held at the family home, not in a church, suggesting either a desire for privacy or perhaps speed, and the couple would reside abroad, with no mention of where or for how long. She searched for any follow-up coverage, accounts of the actual wedding, descriptions of the ceremony, photographs of the bride in her gown. There was nothing. For a family of the Devereux's social standing, this silence was extraordinary. Then Claire searched for Robert Thornton, expanding her search to include Boston newspapers. She found several mentions. Thornton had been involved in shipping ventures, had been investigated for questionable business practices involving cargo insurance fraud, but charges had been dropped due to lack of evidence. There were also brief mentions in Boston society columns, usually noting his presence at events where wealthy widows or unmarried heiresses were present. A pattern emerged. Robert Thornton was a fortune hunter, a man who cultivated relationships with wealthy families, particularly those with daughters of marriageable age. He had been engaged once before to a young woman in Philadelphia, but that engagement had been abruptly broken. Under circumstances the newspapers delicately declined to specify. Claire felt her stomach turn. The Devereux family had married their daughter to a man with a questionable past, a man suspected of fraud, a man whose previous engagement had ended mysteriously. Why would a respectable family do such a thing? She searched for information about the Devereux family's financial situation in 1903 and 1904. It took hours of combing through business records, bankruptcy filings, and property transactions, but eventually she found it. The Devereux sugar plantations had been losing money for several years. A series of bad harvests, combined with increased competition from Caribbean imports, had severely damaged the family's financial foundation. In March 1904, Henri Devereux had taken out a substantial loan to cover debts and maintain the family's lifestyle. The loan had come from a Boston financial firm, a firm in which Robert Thornton was listed as a partner. The picture became clear. Thornton had essentially purchased Amélie Devereux. He had loaned her father money the family desperately needed, and in exchange, he had acquired a beautiful young wife from an old New Orleans family, a wife who would give him social legitimacy and connections. And Amélie, bound by family obligation and social pressure, had had no choice but to accept. Claire expanded her search beyond New Orleans, looking for any mention of Robert and Amélie Thornton in the years following their wedding. The couple had supposedly gone abroad, but where? And had they ever returned? She found the first trace in an unexpected place. A ship's passenger manifest from July 1904. The SS Britannic, sailing from New York to Liverpool, listed among its first-class passengers Mr. and Mrs. R.H. Thornton, bound for extended continental tour. So they had gone to Europe. Claire searched British and French newspaper archives. A tedious process, as digital records from that era were incomplete and often required translation. But 3 months later, she found something. A brief mention in a Paris Society column from October 1904, noting the presence of the American couple Thornton at a reception hosted by a French banking family. Then, nothing. No further mentions in European papers, no record of their return to the United States, no travel documents showing movement between countries. It was as if they had simply vanished somewhere on the continent. Claire shifted her focus back to the Devereux family. If Amélie had corresponded with her parents, if there had been any news of the couple, surely the family would have mentioned it or responded in some documented way. What she found was more disturbing than absence of information. In February 1905, 8 months after the wedding, Madame Celeste Devereux had been admitted to a private sanatorium outside New Orleans for treatment of severe nervous disorder. The admission records, which Claire obtained through the Louisiana Medical Archives, noted that Madame Devereux was inconsolable regarding the fate of her daughter, exhibit symptoms of profound guilt and anxiety. The doctor's notes recorded Madame Devereux's statements. She begged me not to make her marry him. She said he frightened her, that there was something cruel in his eyes. But we needed the money. Henri said we had no choice. And now she's gone, and I don't know if she's alive or dead. No letters come. He won't let her write to us. I know he won't. What have we done? What have we done to our child? Henri Devereux had visited his wife once at the sanatorium in March 1905. The attending physician's notes recorded the conversation. Patient's husband appeared defensive, insisted daughter was well and happy abroad, claimed letters had been sent but perhaps lost in international mail. When patient became agitated, demanding proof of daughter's well-being, husband departed abruptly. He has not returned for subsequent visits. Madame Devereux remained in the sanatorium for 2 years. She was discharged in 1907, but her health never fully recovered. Claire found her death certificate dated November 1908. Cause of death listed as heart failure, but the attending physician had added a note. Patient suffered from prolonged melancholia related to unresolved family tragedy. A mother who had traded her daughter for financial security and who had spent her final years consumed by guilt and fear. Claire felt a deep sadness reading these records. The Devereux family had made a terrible choice, and Madame Devereux at least had recognized the magnitude of their mistake. Too late. But what had happened to Amélie? Was she still alive somewhere in Europe, trapped in a marriage to a cruel man? Had she tried to escape? Or had something worse occurred? Claire needed to find Robert Thornton's trail after 1904. If Amélie was going to be found, Thornton was the key. Claire's breakthrough came from a genealogy researcher in London who specialized in American expatriates in Edwardian Europe. Claire had posted inquiries on several historical research forums, and this researcher, a woman named Elizabeth Parker, had responded with intriguing information. I came across the name Thornton while researching American deaths registered in France between 1904 and 1910, Elizabeth wrote. There's a death certificate from Nice, dated January 1906, for an Amélie Thornton, age 22. Nationality listed as American. Cause of death is recorded as accidental fall from villa balcony. The certificate was filed by her husband, Robert Harrison Thornton. Claire's hands shook as she read the message. Amélie had been dead for nearly 120 years, dying just 18 months after that terrible wedding photograph. An accidental fall? But how many accidents befell young women trapped in abusive marriages? Elizabeth had attached scanned images of the French death certificate and burial record. Claire studied them carefully. The documents were official, properly filed, signed by local authorities in Nice. Amélie had been buried in the Protestant section of the Caucade Cemetery, a small plot purchased by her husband. But there was something else in Elizabeth's message. I kept searching after I found the death record, curious about what happened to the husband. Robert Thornton remained in France for another year, then returned to Boston in 1907. He remarried in 1909, another young woman from a wealthy family, this time from New York. That wife died in 1911, also from an accidental fall, this time from a staircase in their Manhattan home. 2 wives, both dead from falls, both within a few years of marriage. The pattern was unmistakable. Robert Thornton was not just a fortune hunter, he was a murderer, marrying wealthy young women and killing them after securing access to their inheritances or their family's money. Claire immediately contacted the New Orleans Police Department's Historical Crimes Unit. While the cases were far too old for prosecution, Thornton himself was surely long dead, there might be value in officially documenting what had happened. And there might be other victims, other families who had never known the truth about their lost daughters or sisters. The detective she spoke with, a man named James Rousseau who specialized in cold cases, was immediately interested. "We've seen patterns like this before in historical research," he said. "Men who preyed on women in an era when wives had few legal protections and when suspicious deaths could be more easily explained away. Give me everything you have and I'll see what we can find." Claire sent him all her research: the wedding portrait, Jean-Baptiste's journal entry, the Devereux family records, the death certificates, everything. Then she continued her own investigation, searching for more information about Amélie herself. Who had she been before Robert Thornton entered her life? What had she loved? What had she hoped for? What dreams had been stolen from her? The Times-Picayune archives yielded fragments, mentions of Amélie at society events before her marriage, described as accomplished at piano and fluent in French and English. A brief article from 1902 mentioned her participation in a charity benefit for the Children's Hospital, noting her compassionate nature and dedication to helping those less fortunate. A young woman with talent, compassion, and her whole life ahead of her, sold by her desperate parents to a monster, and dead before her 23rd birthday. Detective Rousseau's research over the following weeks uncovered even more than Claire had feared. Robert Harrison Thornton had been married 4 times between 1904 and 1916. All 4 wives had died under suspicious circumstances: falls, drownings, accidents that seemed plausible individually, but formed an undeniable pattern when viewed together. Thornton's method had been consistent: identify a wealthy family in financial difficulty, offer financial assistance or business partnership, court the family's daughter, marry quickly and quietly, then take his new wife away from her family and social network. Within 18 months to 2 years, the wife would die in an accident, and Thornton would inherit whatever money or property had been settled on her through the marriage contract. Between marriages, Thornton would disappear for months or even years, living abroad on his accumulated wealth, then return to the United States to begin the cycle again. He had targeted families in different cities: New Orleans, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, never repeating in the same location, never leaving an obvious trail that might alert authorities or potential victims. He was essentially a serial killer, Rousseau explained when he and Claire met to review the findings. But because his victims were his legal wives, and because he killed them in ways that could be explained as accidents, he was never seriously investigated. In that era, a husband's word about his wife's death was rarely questioned, especially if he was wealthy and socially connected. Rousseau had found death certificates, burial records, and even newspaper articles for all 4 wives. Only Thornton's 4th wife, a woman named Helen Bradford from Baltimore, had attracted any serious scrutiny. Her father, a prominent attorney, had demanded an inquest after her death in 1916. But even then, the coroner's jury had ruled the death accidental, a tragic fall downstairs, despite the father's insistence that his daughter had told him she feared her husband. "What happened to Thornton?" Claire asked. "Did he ever face consequences?" Rousseau showed her a death certificate dated November 1918. Robert Harrison Thornton died in the influenza pandemic. Ironic, really. He survived 4 murders only to be killed by disease. He was 52 years old, died in a hospital in Boston, and was buried in an unmarked grave. He had no children, no remaining family, and apparently no friends willing to pay for a proper burial. Claire felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that Thornton could harm no one else, anger that he had never been brought to justice, and profound sadness for the 4 women whose lives he had stolen. Amélie Devereux had been his first victim, the first young woman destroyed by his calculated cruelty. "I want to do something for them," Claire said. "For Amélie and the others. They deserve to be remembered as more than just victims, more than footnotes in a killer's history." Rousseau nodded. "What did you have in mind?" Claire thought about the wedding portrait, about Jean-Baptiste Laveau's anguished journal entry, about Madame Devereux's guilt-stricken final years. She thought about how Amélie had left evidence of her terror hidden in plain sight: the tears, the bruise, the silent plea in her eyes that the photographer had captured and preserved. "I want to tell their stories," Claire said, "all of them. I want to document who they were, what they loved, what was taken from them, and I want to make sure that photograph, Amelie's wedding portrait, is understood for what it really is: evidence of a crime and a testament to courage." Over the following months, Claire dedicated herself to researching the lives of Robert Thornton's 4 victims. She contacted descendants, searched archives, collected photographs and letters, piecing together portraits of the women as they had been before Thornton destroyed them. Amélie Devereux emerged as a passionate, artistic young woman who had studied piano seriously and had dreamed of becoming a music teacher. Letters to a childhood friend, discovered in a private collection, revealed her love of Chopin and her hope to someday travel to Paris to study, a dream her family's financial problems had made impossible even before Thornton appeared. The second victim, Grace Worthington of New York, had been an accomplished painter whose watercolors had been exhibited at a small gallery in Manhattan. Her family had lost their fortune in a bank failure, and Grace had been quietly supporting them by selling her artwork under a pseudonym. Thornton had learned of the family's situation and had presented himself as a savior. Grace died 6 months after their marriage in 1909, drowning in Lake Como while on their honeymoon. Her paintings had been sold by Thornton immediately after her death. The third victim, Catherine Price of Philadelphia, had been a writer, contributing essays and poetry to literary magazines under her maiden name. She had been engaged to a young journalist, but her family had broken the engagement when their textile business collapsed and creditors threatened foreclosure. Thornton had purchased the business's debts and married Catherine in 1911. She died later that year, falling from a hotel balcony in San Francisco. Her unpublished manuscripts disappeared, presumably destroyed by Thornton. The fourth victim, Helen Bradford of Baltimore, had been working as a volunteer teacher at a school for immigrant children when Thornton met her. Her attorney father had been handling a complex bankruptcy case and had borrowed money to cover the legal fees involved. Thornton had provided the loan, then courted Helen aggressively. Despite her misgivings, she had confided to friends that Thornton frightened her. Family pressure had prevailed. She died in 1916, and her father spent his remaining years trying unsuccessfully to prove murder. 4 brilliant, talented, compassionate women whose potential had been extinguished by a man who saw them only as means to wealth. Claire felt the weight of their stolen futures as she compiled their stories. She worked with the New Orleans Historical Collection to create a special exhibition. Hidden in plain sight, the wedding portrait and the story it concealed. The exhibition centered on Emily's photograph, with Jean-Baptiste Laveau's journal entry displayed alongside the enhanced images showing the tears and bruise beneath the veil. But the exhibition also told the complete story, all 4 victims, their lives and dreams, the pattern of Thornton's crimes, and the systemic failures that had allowed him to continue killing for 12 years. Claire included information about domestic violence resources, drawing connections between historical and contemporary issues, showing how women in abusive situations still often struggle to be believed and protected. The exhibition opened in October 2024, and the response was overwhelming. Descendants of all 4 victims attended, many meeting each other for the first time, sharing family stories that had been whispered about for generations but never fully understood. The bruise beneath Emily's veil, once hidden by shadow and time, now served as undeniable evidence, not just of one man's cruelty, but of a society that had made it possible for such cruelty to thrive. The exhibition's most powerful moment came during the opening reception, when Claire noticed an elderly woman standing motionless before Emily's wedding portrait. The woman's eyes were filled with tears, and she held a worn photograph in her trembling hands. Claire approached gently. "I'm Claire Duchamp, the curator. Can I help you?" The woman turned, and Claire saw profound emotion in her weathered face. "My name is Marie Devereux-Laurent. Emily was my great-great-aunt. I never knew her story. My family never spoke of her. They said only that she had married and died young abroad. No details, no explanation. It was as if she had been erased." She held up the photograph she carried, a portrait of a young girl, perhaps 14 years old, smiling at the camera with bright, hopeful eyes. "This is Amélie, before everything went wrong, before her family's financial troubles, before Thornton. This is who she really was." Claire felt tears welling in her own eyes. "Well, would you be willing to have this photograph included in the exhibition? People should see her as she was, not just in that terrible wedding portrait." Marie nodded. "That's why I brought it. When I read about the exhibition, I knew I had to come, had to share this. Emily deserves to be remembered as more than a victim. She was talented, kind, full of life. And she tried to resist. My grandmother told me stories passed down through the family. Emily begged not to be forced into the marriage. She knew something was wrong with Thornton, but her father wouldn't listen." Over the following hour, Marie shared everything she knew about Amélie, family stories, personality traits, dreams, and fears. Claire recorded it all, incorporating Marie's memories into the exhibition narrative. The smiling photograph of young Amélie was placed beside the wedding portrait, creating a devastating before and after comparison. Hope and joy transformed into fear and despair. In the weeks after the exhibition opened, more descendants came forward. A great-granddaughter of Grace Worthington brought several of Grace's watercolors, beautiful landscapes that had survived in her family's attic. A descendant of Catherine Price discovered a trunk containing Catherine's unpublished manuscripts, poetry and essays that revealed a sharp intellect and deep empathy for those struggling with poverty and injustice. Helen Bradford's great-nephew donated letters Helen had written to friends, expressing her fears about Thornton and her anguish at being pressured into marriage. Each edition enriched the exhibition, building a fuller picture of who these women had been and what had been stolen from them. They had been artists, writers, teachers, musicians, women with gifts to offer the world, women who had been sacrificed by families desperate to maintain social standing or escape financial ruin. The exhibition became national news, featured in historical journals and popular media. Scholars wrote papers analyzing the intersection of gender, class, and violence in early 20th century America. Domestic violence organizations used the exhibition as a teaching tool, showing how patterns of abuse and coercive control had existed throughout history, often hidden behind veils of respectability. But for Claire, the most meaningful outcome was simpler. She had given voice to 4 women whose stories had been silenced. She had transformed a wedding portrait from evidence of family complicity and abuse into a testament to one young woman's attempt to leave proof of her suffering, knowing that someday someone might understand. That heavy veil, meant to conceal Amelie's tears and bruises, had ultimately failed in its purpose. Modern technology had pierced the shadows, revealing the truth Jean-Baptiste Laveau had sensed but could not quite see. And now, more than a century later, Amélie Devereux and the 3 women who shared her fate were finally being remembered, not as nameless victims or shameful family secrets, but as individuals whose lives had mattered, whose talents had been real, and whose courage in the face of impossible circumstances deserved recognition. The wedding portrait remained on permanent display at the New Orleans Historical Collection. Its enhanced details clearly visible, Amelie's tear-streaked face and hidden bruise no longer concealed. Visitors stood before it in silence, reading her story, understanding what that photograph truly represented. A moment of terror captured and preserved, transformed by time and persistence into justice, remembrance, and warning.